emergency legislation. As we have agreed numerous times, the power of making legislation is with the people, and because the people do not have the time to be involved in the issuance of every piece of legislation or every rule, it was decided that each area will appoint a representative to represent it in Parliament, in the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives will be charged with making legislation on behalf of the nation or on behalf of the community. Like any organization, the House of Representatives has holidays. And as you all know, here in Egypt, we are very generous with our holidays. We have the Eid holiday 5 days. We have the Great Bayram holiday 5 days. We have the Small Bayram of 4 days. We have, as we are coming up soon, Sharm el-Nisim. So, for us, and then, moreover, our House of Representatives stops working in May and starts again in October. What does that mean in real terms? In real terms, it means that we have a period of 6 months where we do not have a body, where we do not have the House of Representatives there to make laws. Laws that could cover new situations that may require the enactment of urgent rules. Problem? Let us through this lecture take as an example the problem I spoke to you about, which is the problem of synthetic drugs. Assume someone in Egypt has discovered new type of synthetic drug. Now let us understand the background for a minute. What is the background for drugs in Egypt? We have a law prohibiting the sale of drugs, but that law is very specific in the sense that it indicates every type of drug that is prohibited and that may result in going to jail. What that means in real terms, if a new drug is discovered that is not on the list, then Parliament must move, the House of Representatives Parliament must move very quickly to make it illegal to make or trade in that drug. So if Parliament is on holiday and a new drug is invented, it can be sold and people can die before Parliament have the time to enact legislation, or the House of Representatives. I will refer to House of Representatives and Parliament as one. But the technical term for our Parliament still today is the word House of Representatives. We are going in the future to have a Senate, but until today, we only have the House of Representatives. Going back to our problem. A guy invents synthetic drugs. We are in the middle of our August holiday. Everybody's on the beach in Alexandria, especially members of Parliament, enjoying themselves. And a new synthetic drug is discovered. What is the problem with that synthetic drug? If you take it it makes you very happy. It makes you not worry about your education, not worry about classes, not worry about anything. And it has a minor downside, which is you die in 3 days. 3 days, meter running. Can we call the House of Representatives and have them call them in for a meeting from all over Egypt and have them discuss a law and have them enact a new law making this synthetic drug illegal in 3 days? Of course not. It could take weeks, it could take months. What are we talking about here? We are talking about a problem that needs urgent action from the House of Representatives while the House of Representatives is on holiday or in recess. Recess means they are on holiday, it could be the whole summer holiday, it could be the Great Bayram, or even another worse situation which is the House of Representatives being dissolved. As the President has the right to dissolve the House of Parliament, to the House of Representatives at any time, and call for new elections. And that normally takes about 3 months. So either they're on holiday on the beach, or the President has decided to dissolve it, or at the end of their term, so new House of Representatives keeps proposing, and a major problem comes up. In our constitution, the Egyptian people, when they made the constitution, they authorized the President, if Parliament is on recess, if there is an urgent emergency, an urgent matter, and Parliament, the House of Representatives, is on holiday or recess or dissolved, for the President to make the rules, and then said rules would be approved by the House of Representatives later on. So what does this really mean? It means that in our constitution, the people gave the President the right to make laws when the House of Representatives is dissolved or in recess, provided those laws are approved by Parliament when Parliament comes back. What do we call these laws? We call them decrees. We call them presidential decrees. Now we'll talk about the conditions for, I gave you an overview, but now we're going to speak specifically about the conditions for what we call here emergency legislation. Condition number 1, it must be an urgent and necessary matter. Both urgent and necessary. There must be a necessity for action at the time. Assume it is an important matter, but it can wait. Then the President cannot enact legislation. So the condition number 1, it must be an urgent matter that must be dealt with without delay. Like exactly the example I gave you, which is synthetic drug. People are dying. Who decides that it is urgent? It is left to the President because Parliament is no longer there. This is condition number 1. Urgent matter and necessary matter. Number 2, the House of Representatives must not be there. When is the House of Representatives not there? If they are on holiday, recess, or dissolved, or dissolved when the President, as I said, dissolves Parliament and invites people to elect a new Parliament. Condition number 3, most important. That decree, that law made by the President must be submitted to the House of Representatives within 15 days after their first meeting after the recess. So assume the President made a decree. Parliament came back on June 1st. That decree must be submitted to Parliament within 15 days from Parliament coming back from recess or holiday. So Parliament on holiday came back on June 1st. By June 15, it must be submitted. And Parliament asked to approve it or reject it. So what happens if it is not submitted within 15 days? Then it is no longer there, it falls. It is cancelled. It's as if it was not there. Let's do a practical example. Synthetic drugs, President made a decree. Parliament came back on the 15th of, making it illegal. Parliament came back on the 15th of June. Parliament came back on the 1st of June. Nothing was submitted by the 15th of June. What happens to that law? It is cancelled. It is no longer applicable. It is no longer applied in the country. So first condition we said, urgent and necessary. House of Representatives recess or holiday must be submitted within 15 days from the holiday, from the first meeting after the recess or holiday. Condition number 4, there is no condition number 4. Now we're going to discuss what happens when it is submitted. Parliament can approve it. Fair enough. So what happens? It continues to be applied. For example, if someone was using synthetic drugs and he went to jail and Parliament approved it, he remains in jail. Parliament approved the decree of the President, he remains in jail. Option number 2, Parliament rejects the law completely. What happens in that case? Two situations. Situation number 1, Parliament can reject the law completely from day one, and this is what we call retroactivity. What does retroactivity mean? It means if the president made a decree that someone would go to jail for the use of synthetic drugs, and that guy went to jail and the court ordered him 5 years in jail, and he was already in jail, if the decree is cancelled by Parliament retroactively, it means as if it was never there, as if it was never made by the president, as if it never existed. So what happens? That guy comes out of jail. Not only comes out of jail, on his on his criminal sheet, it no longer says that he committed a crime. So, scenario number 1, cancel retroactively. Scenario number 2, also cancel, but Parliament in the cancellation says that says in the cancellation that people who went to jail under the law will continue to be in jail. Which means the law is only the decree or the law is cancelled from a specific date and not from the date that it was enacted by the president. Example: someone used synthetic drugs, he was caught, he went to court, he was sent to jail for 5 years, and then and he was in jail. On the 1st of June, Parliament came back. On the 15th of June, Parliament cancelled the decree, but not retroactively. It said it is cancelled from the 15th of June only. And it also said in the cancellation that people who are in jail will remain in jail. So what happens to him? He remains in jail. And what does happen to his criminal sheet? It will show that he has committed a crime. The second side of the spectrum is approved as it is, and in this case, no disruption. Ahmed, for example, used synthetic drugs. He went to jail. The law is approved by Parliament. He remains in jail. Scenario 2, Mahmoud went to jail. He was judged. He is in jail. He was decided by a court. The law goes to Parliament on the 1st of June. On the 15th of June, it is cancelled retroactively. What happens to our friend? He gets out of jail completely and it's cancelled from his criminal sheet. It's very important. Retroactively means as if it never existed. So if someone in jail, he goes out. If someone paid the fine, he gets back his fine. So for us to understand, it is important here to realize that emergency legislation is like a power of attorney. It is an authority given to the president under supervision of Parliament and only applies if Parliament is in recess and it is an urgent matter. So if Parliament is there, there is no emergency legislation. This is the end of emergency legislation. But what we have to remember, what Parliament is authorizing the President to do in this case is only ordinary legislation. It is not subsidiary legislation. It is not the Constitution. It's only allowed to enact ordinary legislation, and we call it a presidential decree. In our previous lectures, we discussed who has the right to make laws. And it was basically the people in Parliament, the House of Representatives for the Constitution, ordinary legislation, the House of Representatives, and in case of emergency, the President. What we're going to talk about today is how to interpret legislation, how to read legislation, how to understand legislation. And the first test for us in understanding legislation is when we have two pieces of legislation dealing with the same matter. Assume we have two laws, both of them dealing with the punishment for the crime of theft. One law says 3 years, and one law says 2 years. Which one would you apply? The one saying 3 years, or the one saying 2 years? What would you look for in the wording of these laws to guide you with regard to how they should be applied? I think the first lesson for us in the issue of understanding or interpreting laws, 2 different laws or 3 different laws. Again, remember what we're talking about. We're talking about 2 laws or 3 laws. The 3 of them have a rule relating to a certain topic. One law says theft. If you commit theft, you go to jail for 3 years. Another law saying if you commit theft, you go to jail for 1 year. Another law saying if you commit theft, you go to jail for 5 years. And you are the judge, or you are the lawyer, or you're the person accused, and you're reading the 3 laws and you want to decide which one is the binding one. So the first question we're going to ask ourselves is which one of them has been revoked? Because we cannot have 3 rules applying on the same issue at the same time with different results. So the first question that we're going to focus on today is what are the rules for cancelling a law and applying another law instead. And cancellation, we call it revocation. Revocation, revoke, which means cancel, which means that law is no longer applied and another law is applied in its place. There are 2 types of revocation. Explicit revocation, which is clear, undeniable, you can't miss it. You can't miss it. You don't need to read carefully. It is very clear to you. And implicit means something that is not clear, that is left for you to understand from the meaning. Let us give the example of explicit revocation and implicit revocation with regard to rules enacted by your father. Assume, for example, assume your father has made the following rule, and then you tell me whether it's explicit or implicit. On Saturday, he said, assume your father, for example, is a tough guy, so each rule has a number. So rule number 2000 says everybody must be home by 9 o'clock. Rule number, and then that was on a Saturday. Everybody must come home by 9 o'clock. And then on Wednesday, he made rule number 2005. It said, I am cancelling rule number 2000 completely, and now everybody should come back at 6 in the afternoon. Can you deny? Isn't it clear? Because he said, I am cancelling my rule number 2000, replacing it by the rule of 2005. Accordingly, everybody must be home by 6 and cannot claim that it was not clear. Right? Explicit, very clear. Cancelling. Another way, for example, if your father says, you normally come back at 10, and then your father issues a rule saying everybody should come back at 5 for 1 week, which means the rule was passed on Saturday, it applies until Friday. We are the Sunday after the Friday, which is 9 days after the rule was made. Is it clear that the rule of 5 o'clock is no longer applicable? Yes, because he said, I will. This rule applies only for 1 week. So after the lapse of 1 week, it is clear that the rule no longer applies. Let us turn this is what we call explicit. Let us now apply it on laws. With laws, explicit is very simple, at least in my mind. Law number 1 says the crime of theft is 5 years. That law number 1 was passed on a Saturday. And then law number 2 is passed on a Monday, 3 days later, and it says we are hereby cancelling law number 1, and the crime of theft is punishable only by 1 year. Explicit, clear, you can't deny it. You look at 1, you look at 2, 2 says cancel 1. Very clear. There's no doubt about it. Let's take another example. Especially, let us take an example that we are in today. We are now under what we call non-movement. You are not, restriction of movement. You are not allowed to move between 7 o'clock in the evening and 6 o'clock in the morning. Right? Normally we can move all day long, right? But a law was passed, law number 1. Law number 20 said you're not allowed to move in Egypt between 7 o'clock at night and 6 o'clock in the morning. And it says this rules applies until the 15th of March. We are now on the 16th or 18th of March. Is it clear to you that that law no longer applies? Yes, and this is again explicit because you can't miss it. It is very clear to you that you know the period, you know when it's applied and when it stops to be applied. So this explicit means something obvious, clear to you. Now we come to a different type of revocation, which is implicit or indirect revocation. Indirect revocation is where some interpretation is required or some understanding of the rules of interpretation is required. Okay, law number 1 says theft is punishable by 5 years. That was passed on Saturday. On the Monday after it, law number 2 says theft, same condition, same crime, theft is punishable by one year. Which one would you apply? Would you apply the law that was made on a Saturday, or would you apply law number 1 that made on Saturday, or law number 2 that was made on a Monday? Law number 2 does not say, I cancel law number 1. It just says the crime of theft is now punishable only by 1 year. What are you supposed to do in this case? The rule is simple. You apply the latest rule. So if I have 2 rules, one yesterday, one today, on the same matter, I apply the rule of today. Now, implicit and indirect requires a bit of understanding, a bit of interpretation. But basically, the new law cancels the old law. Now, the explicit means that the cancellation is not clear. You must read it yourself. You must try and understand it. Normally, the latest law cancels, the latest rule cancels the rule that deals with the same matter that was before. Laws are divided into laws applying to all Egyptians, which are called general laws, and laws applying to a specific category or group of people. And I will now explain in the next slide how does this affect revocation, implicit revocation and implicit revocation. We are now in slide 4 of lecture 5. In this slide, I'm going to cover issues that are not covered in the slide, but are covered to you in the detailed slides of the tutorial. This slide in the lecture deals with implicit and explicit revocation. But in my lecture on this slide, I will also deal with several other important issues. how does the explicit and implicit revocation apply to the different rules, to the different laws? Laws, generally, we have laws applying to all Egyptians, or laws applying to a specific category of Egyptians. Laws applying to all Egyptians are called general laws. Laws applying to a specific category are called specific laws. And I will discuss in this slide how does the revocation, the explicit revocation and the implicit revocation apply on the general and specific laws. I will also deal with whether ignorance in the law is not an excuse. Please remember that the slides covering general and specific will be given to you in the tutorial, but I will give you the general lecture now. And please also remember that the issue of ignorance of the law, you're going to get slides for the tutorial, but I will deal with it now. The most thing important to remember with regard to the ignorance of the law is the heading. Ignorance of the law is not an excuse. And I'm going to talk about all of this as we go along. Let us remind ourselves where we were. We were simply saying that if the revocation is clear, it's called explicit. And how is the revocation clear? When law number 2 says I'm cancelling law number 1, or when we have a law applicable for a period of time. Clearly states that this law only applies for a certain period of time. After that period of time, that law is very explicitly cancelled, and I gave the example, which is the restriction of movement. We have restriction of a law restricting our movement in Egypt from 7 o'clock in the morning, 7 o'clock in the evening, until 6 o'clock in the morning, until the 15th of April. On the 18th of April, we can all move, and it's very clear. What is implicit revocation, which is not, the revocation does not clearly say law number 2 cancelling law number 1. We have to read both laws. And we said that the general rule is, not the general, the very specific rule is the latest cancels the one before. So if a law was passed yesterday and you pass today, making theft a crime punishable in the law of yesterday by 5 years and in the law of today by 1 year, then we apply the law of today. We apply the law of today, and this is called an implicit, because you have to read both of them to understand. The other one, in the explicit, is very clear. It says on the top, law number 2 cancels 1, or it says it is applied for a specific duration. Now, let us discuss how does implicit and explicit revocation or cancellation applies on the different rules. Let us remind ourselves there are what we call general laws and what we call specific laws. Fine, what does that really mean? It means in real terms that, for example, you may have a law that is applicable on all Egyptians. And you may have another law applicable on JUC students. Let us do ourselves, or let's take a better example. We have a law that is applicable on all university students in Egypt, and another law that is applicable on JUC students. Both passed on the same day. Let's take an example. On Saturday at 9 o'clock in the morning, a law was passed saying all students of Egyptian universities must go to the university, must enter the university by 11 o'clock. And on the same time, another law was passed saying all JUC, okay, the first one, all students in Egypt, is a general law. And then a specific law saying all JUC students must enter the university by 9. Does any of these laws revoke the other? No. Because the one of general application, all Egyptian students, apply to all students. The one of JUC students specific only applies to JUC students. So there is no revocation, there is no cancellation. General laws applies on general laws, and specific laws applies on specific laws. Let's take the example further. On Saturday, a law was passed that all students in Egypt must enter the university by 11 o'clock. And then on Monday, another general law was passed, all students of Egyptian universities must enter the university by 12 o'clock. and we are on Tuesday. Which one we apply? We apply the latest of Monday. And if I'm a student anywhere else other than the JUC, I go to university up to 12. Let's do the same time. At the same time, on Saturday, a law was passed making JUC students, all JUC students must enter the university by 9. And then on Monday, another law was passed saying all JUC students must come to the university by 10:30. And I am on Tuesday. I am a JUC student. What is my deadline? Is it 12 like the general law, or is 10:30 like the specific law? It is 10:30 like the specific. But what we're going to say, a general law cancels a general law, and a specific law cancels a specific law, whether explicit or implicit. We can say law number one. All students of Egyptian universities must enter university by 10. By 10. That was on Saturday. And then on Monday, law number 2 says all students of Egyptian universities must enter by 12. Did it say law number 2 cancelling 1? No, so it is implicit. What do I apply? The latest. Another example. Law number 1, all students of Egyptian universities must enter the university by 10. Saturday. On Monday, new law. Law number 2 says, we are cancelling law number 1, and all Egyptian students in universities must come in the university by 12. This is an explicit. Let's go again for the specific. On Saturday, a law was passed, law number 5 was passed, in which it said all GUC students must enter the university by 9 o'clock. And then on Monday, another law was passed saying all GUC students must enter the university by 10:30. Did it say it's cancelling law number 5? Law number 6. Did it say it's cancelling law number 5? What do we call this? Explicit or implicit? It is implicit, because I have to read the two versions, decide which one should be applied. Now another example. Law number 5 says all GUC students must enter the university by 9. And then law number 6, this was a Saturday. And then law number 6 on Monday says all GUC students must enter the university by 11. But before it said that, it said, first line in law number 6 was saying, law number 5 is cancelled and all GUC students must enter the university by 11:30. So this is explicit revocation. So for us, general revokes general and specific revokes specific. Why is that? Because each one has a different group that it is applicable to. Okay, so now we finished implicit, explicit revocation. We've covered general laws and specific laws. Now we move into something else, which again you'll see the slide in the tutorial, but it will not be here. It is the issue of the ignorance of the law is not an excuse. First of all, let us agree that if the official gazette came to your area, we're not talking about the idea of the force majeure we spoke about before. Assume, for this part of the lecture, we assume that the official gazette came to your area on time. And instead, the law applies from the 1st of April. So on the 2nd of April, you must apply the law. Can you claim you don't know the law? No, because ignorance of the law is not an excuse. Now comes a practical problem. Rules are divided into mandatory rules and explanatory rules. What are the mandatory rules? These are rules that you must apply. For example, it says all sale must be in Egyptian pounds. Can you sell in dollars? No. It is mandatory that you sell in Egyptian pounds. Assume a rule says you are free to choose the currency that you like, but if you do not choose, if the two parties do not choose in the buying or selling the currency, we apply the US dollar. This is what. Is it mandatory? No. You are allowed to agree to something else, so it is called explanatory rule. Let us start making things simple. Ignorance of the law is not an excuse, right? The official gazette came to my area, the law applies from the 15th of April. The law says all sale must be in Egyptian pounds. All sale of cars must be in Egyptian pounds, all right? And Mahmoud is buying from Tariq. I am buying from him a car. Can we write in the contract that I sell him in US dollars? No. It must be in Egyptian pounds. There is no excuse. Now, Mahmoud and Tariq also are buying from each other a plane, an aeroplane. The law in Egypt for aeroplane says any contract for sale of aeroplane, the parties can decide the currency. But if they do not agree, payment is in US dollar. So option number one, we can agree on any currency. And if we do not agree, then we must pay in US dollars. Mahmoud is asking Tariq, are we supposed to apply this rule of the US dollar or not? Answer. Or even more than that, is application of the rule that says if you're buying an aeroplane, you can agree on a currency, and if you do not agree, you pay in dollars, is the part relating to payment in dollars mandatory, or we can say we're not going to apply it. Or we can say, because it is not mandatory, if we do not know about it, it must not be applied. The answer is quite simple. Every rule, the mandatory very clear, you must apply it with your eyes closed. The explanatory is also applicable, but applicable in its own way. What does applicable in its own way mean? It means that the law gave you the right to agree, and if you do not agree, then you have to pay in US dollars. All explanatory rules are like this. These are rules of law that allow parties to agree to something else, but it tells them, if you don't agree, then that rule will be applied. So the question for us, is ignorance of the law an excuse for mandatory rules? The definite answer is no. Is ignorance of the law an excuse for explanatory rules? The answer is still no. The only difference is the way the explanatory rules are applied. The parties are allowed to agree otherwise, but if they do not agree, they still have to apply what the law indicates. So for us, we have to remember that the principle of ignorance of the law applies irrespective of the type of rule, whether it's explanatory or mandatory. All rules must be applied, and the excuse of ignorance of the law cannot be used under any scenario for a pretext of the non-application of the law, of the rule, of the explanatory rule, as long as the situation occurs. So, Tariq and Mahmoud could not agree on the sale of the aeroplane currency. They must write in the contract that the sale is going to be in US dollars. So all rules, whether mandatory or explanatory, must be followed, and using ignorance of the law as an excuse cannot